along and move along with your day. So without further ado, if we could all give a warm welcome to Jennifer Couch.
Good morning, everyone. Well, this morning we have This Country of Ours, which, as many of you know, turned into a book, but there is a story behind that, and that was by Benjamin Harrison. So after leaving the White House, Harrison had several important legal cases, other engagements such as speaking at Stanford University, but he also did a good deal of writing. At the suggestion of Edward Bok, who was the editor of Ladies' Home Journal, he wrote a series of articles on the nature of the federal government and the duties of the president. These articles were featured in the article in the magazine under the title This Country of Ours. So the articles went from December of 1895 through May of 1897. So on the table here you can see we have several copies of Ladies' Home Journal. Some of them are open to that page. So again, they have that title there with This Country of Ours, and then actually as I go along there's another little subgroup that he did a little bit later. But Bok first approached Harrison while he was still in the White House. In 1892, Bok had published an entire series of the Ladies' Home Journal written by famous daughters of famous men, and that happened to include Mary Harrison McKee. So we also have in our collection, and I didn't bring it out today, a copy of that 1892 issue where Mary Harrison McKee has an article about raising children. And so an interesting little side note. And that particular series was so popular that Bok saw an opportunity, and that, of course, for the magazine, but he saw an opportunity that also he had noticed this gathering strength in women's suffrage movement at the time. And he realized, he thought, that the women needed to prepare for the right to vote. And Bok felt that there was a deficiency there, and that women were not maybe prepared, didn't know as much about the government and how things went along as they should if they were going to get the vote. So he set out to put President Benjamin Harrison under contract the moment he left office to write a series of these articles. After all, he thought, who better than the president himself? Harrison liked the idea, but he felt that he wouldn't have time to devote to the project, so he actually suggested speaking with Secretary of State James G. Blaine. Blaine had talked to Bok and had been under agreement to do that, but unfortunately then Blaine passed away. Bok then returned to Benjamin Harrison, and they did enter into an agreement to write the articles immediately upon his retirement of office. So an interesting side note that I've shared before but wanted to share again, we talked once about Harrison and his cigars. Well, Bok is one of the people in his biography who wrote a very fun little story talking about Benjamin Harrison and cigars. So when Bok went to the White House to meet with him to talk about doing these articles, they had dinner, they went for a walk. Harrison offered him a cigar. Bok, who was a little bit younger, had not partaken in cigars particularly. And he had heard that Harrison liked particularly dark black cigars. And President Harrison then handed him this large black, inky black, he says, and big cigar, and lit it for him. With a whiff or two of the cigar, he said it went right to his head and to the furthest corners of his brain. And he felt that it was, he did smoke it to the bitter end, and he said it was bitter. And about 15 minutes later was very sick. So he was very glad that Harrison had said, well, we better go in, because he was feeling quite ill. So kind of a fun little side story there that with the cigar that he shared later of his talk with Benjamin Harrison. But after they had this agreement, Bok survived the cigar, and they continued to meet. And there are actually many letters between Bok and Harrison over the years concerning the articles. We have a couple of letters in our collections where he's writing to other people, where Harrison says, well, I've got to go write my article, or makes mention of them. The Indiana Historical Society actually has a collection of letters between Harrison and Bok, and then there are some on the Library of Congress microfilms of the Harrison papers. So just to share a few little tidbits from those correspondence with them, Harrison agrees in November of 1894 to write 6 or more articles for Ladies' Home Journal. And in November, he has received a check to go ahead and do those. So it's kind of funny. He jokes that he might have to send the check back because he's not used to getting paid ahead of time when he hasn't actually completed the work. And at that time, and I assume that was sort of the beginning, it was $2,500 that he received at that time to start writing those. And then actually early on in that November letter, they actually start about the fact that maybe these articles can become a book later. So that's very early on in the discussion that they think about turning the articles into a book. So Bach actually talks about coming to visit him here to discuss them. In June of 1895, he again mentions the check, and he says, my proposal to return the check was only half serious. I was going to keep the money. And at the end, he's saying it's very warm in June. He's having a little difficulty getting into writing, but he says, perhaps the dread of what may subside when I finally enter upon the work. So he's getting himself prepared to write these articles. And apparently it was a very hot year. He writes again in September of 1895 that it was 94 degrees at 11 o'clock in the morning, and he was on the porch. But that if he could withstand the heat, he would work on his second article at that time while he was there too. He does mention one other time, I'm not sure how much he got paid for doing all of them, but in February of '96, he confirms that he received $500 for the 6th article and that he was working on the 7th article at that time as well. So then he actually, in March of '96, talks about the upcoming articles. And the next 3 articles, he's talking about discussing pardoning power and impeachment, timely subject right now. But it is interesting in the book and in the articles, he is very, they're for education purposes, and that is clear. So he's telling what that branch of government does. He talks about, the Treasury, the Post Office, the Presidency, the Congress, the Constitution, but they are very educational, and it's not that he's necessarily like sharing his opinion about any particular part of those jobs, but just laying out how those are set up in our government and how they would function. So he does continue writing back and forth with them. In September of 1896, they discuss in a letter that he's actually contracted with Scribner & Sons to execute the book. And Ladies' Home Journal has basically given him, permission to go ahead with the book. They feel that they have got what they wanted out of the articles, so they're not having any tie to the publication of the book of This Country of Ours. And then This Country of Ours was so successful that Ladies' Home Journal actually asked Harrison to write a second set of articles that was depicting the personal life and the domestic life in the White House. And actually this last issue over here on the side from A of 1897 is the domestic side of the White House. So in that, again, when he's writing back and forth to Bach, he says he will just tell the nature of how things go on in the White House, and not really like any personal stories or insight, but just how the White House functioned, but at that domestic level as well. So again, we have several of these in our collection. The book in the middle is bound copies from the year of 1895, the first set. So sometimes libraries in different places would do that. They would take the entire year and actually put them in book format. And then the other individual copies as well. Now some of them we have copies in our own collection that were just here in the house, so they were copies that Harrison had. We have accumulated a few others, and actually I plan to try to fill in those gaps because we don't have every single issue from December of 1895 to May of 1897. But they are also in the microfilm reels. They have actually like the proof pages that are in the Library of Congress. So they would send the proofs to Harrison, and he would look at them beforehand. And again, one of the letters and corresponding back and forth was a different employee at Ladies' Home Journal had sent it to him and was like, we're under the wire here a little bit. You'd have to send this back so it gets back to New York by Monday or whatever. So you have those deadlines and those time constraints back then as well. So then in January of 1897, Harrison actually declines Bach's offer to write any additional articles. He expresses his gratefulness for the opportunity to do the articles that he has done, and the friendliness that Bach had greeted him with in doing these articles and all of that, but he said the burden of producing something monthly is very heavy. So he felt that he wanted to move on, I think at that time, so again in January of 1897. So as another little fun side note story to end, Bach in his memoirs, we talked about the cigar, so I love these little insights. During the later years of his life, Bach tried to interest Benjamin Harrison, former President of the United States, whose physician had ordered him to have moderate outdoor exercise, it says. Bach offered to equip President Harrison with the necessary clubs and balls to play golf. So when Harrison received the golf balls as a gift, he wrote back to Bach, "Thank you, but does a bottle of ligament go with each ball?" And I don't think he ever took up golf. I don't know if he ever liked golf at all, even tried. So just another funny little side note between Harrison and Bach. And then I do have here too, as you look around, there are a couple copies of letters that I printed of Harrison and Bach. And we have several copies. I'll ask if you want to thumb through this Country of Ours, I'll let you look at this particular issue that I have. But again, every branch of government that is covered, and talking about patriotism, and just my looking at this again, I think that maybe this is something we should share with all of our government civic classes yet today. So we should read Harrison. And any questions?
Is that still in publication, still in print?
I think they have reprinted it Google Books. I think it's up on Google Books as well.
I got a copy from Amazon.
Oh,
There's a book company called Abe Books, ABE Books. I don't know if anybody's used that.
Yeah.
They have a lot of original